call this meeting to order of the Environmental Review Committee of the City of Cupertino. Today is August 31st, 2018. Please join us in pledging allegiance to the flag. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. And I guess I'll conduct the roll call or does anyone want to conduct the roll call with respect? I don't see a clerical individual here to record the meeting minutes and such, so I'll do that. City Manager Chan? Here. Chad, remember me of your last name, I'm blanking for some reason. Chad Mosley from Public Works? Here. All right. RT Srivastava from our Community Development, Planning and Community Development Department? Here. Jeff Paulson from our Planning Commission.
Here.
And I'm here, Mayor Darcy Paul of our city. Okay, so we're all here and the meeting is convened. The first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes of our draft minutes of July 5th, 2018. Would anyone like to make any comment with regard to these minutes? Are there any speaker cards with regard? Are we doing speaker cards on this meeting?
No, Mr. Mayor, we generally just have the speaker state their name.
Okay, so let's do that. If anyone has any comments from the public regarding the draft minutes, please just, and this applies to other items as well, please line up at the microphone and you'll be provided your normal 3 minutes. Seeing none, let's go ahead and close off the public comment. I'll bring it back up here. Is there a motion to approve the draft minutes of July 5th?
I so move.
And is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstain.
Okay, motion passes 401 to approve the minutes of July 5th. We're at oral communications now, and this is the portion of the meeting that that pertains to anything that is not agendized on the meeting. And so please line up at the microphone that we have set up for members of the public. Again, you'll be given 3 minutes to speak, and please introduce yourself. And I will give you a 1 minute as well as a 15-second indication of your time. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Griffin. I live on Calvert Drive in Eastern Cupertino. I wanted to do a shout out that people need to be aware that the hotel that is being proposed at Stern Avenue at Stevens Creek Boulevard in Stern, which is currently a Shell gas station as proposed to be a AC hotel by San Jose. That is currently going through the environmental impact review for San Jose. Many people in the neighborhood have written in opposition and pointed out an inadequate traffic survey. They only looked at the Stern and Stevens Creek intersection. They didn't look at any other parts of the intersection. There's a 150 child daycare center at the Spino building directly across the street in Cupertino jurisdiction. That was not mentioned hardly at all. Comments can be turned in until the 14th of September. We are looking for a strong pushback from Cupertino politicos against this hotel. It is a travesty. It looks like something that should be built in the Tenderloin 100 years ago. The architecture is not up to par for anywhere, and it is a blight on the eastern gateways into Cupertino, especially with the new Apple campus. How would you like to have someone going to the September 12th Apple conference at the Steve Jobs Center at 10 a.m. coming off of 280 southbound at Stevens Creek and seeing a monstrosity like that 8-story hotel stuck on the corner with no architectural review and no trees? They're going to think that that is the way Cupertino allows their buildings to be built. Well, we don't allow them that way. That's the way San Jose is doing it. And it reflects poorly on San Jose. It reflects poorly on Cupertino.
1 minute
and
remaining.
It reflects poorly on Apple. That building is not up to standards that Cupertino has way high standards architecturally and environmentally than San Jose. I wish we can annex West San Jose. They don't belong to the rest of the city. They're better because they care. But that proposed hotel has had no architectural review. And the cruise ship building in Santa Clara, I was there, had no architectural review, even though the Planning Commission in Santa Clara recommended it. The City Council in Santa Clara okayed it without sending it to architectural review. And that's why it looks like it. The cruise ship building is far better than that ugly,
15
horrible
seconds.
Tenderloin Hotel. Please don't let that travesty blight the eastern end of Cupertino. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next speaker, welcome. Hi, Kitty.
Hi, I also live on the east side of Cupertino, and I've looked at the Stern and Stevens Creek Hotel as well. It's 95 feet high, and the side yards are they're a little over 3 feet, and one of them is around like 1 foot to 10 inches. And there's a concrete block wall instead of a fence. So I really don't see how they're going to be able to do even basic maintenance at that location around, I'm trying to get around the building. And I'm also concerned for fire safety. If the hotel were to have a fire and people, you know, God forbid, are trying to exit through their windows and they've got a concrete block wall in a very narrow space, I think it could be, you know, a disaster, basically. Also, just the location it's inappropriate for what they're trying to build. I want to bring something up. I had requested information about the Vallco SB 35 project. I asked for the street plans on Stevens Creek Boulevard, and I was given a 1974 landscape plan, and that was when I was writing you, the city, about how the plans were showing a non-existent driveway. And I looked at Measure D, and I also found the same non-existent driveway. It was something that had been there for, let's see, maybe it was there 20 years ago. And so I'm appalled that a civil engineer at the city sent me a landscape plan and trying to pass it off to me as though it were an actual street plan. I find that extremely offensive. I was sent all sorts of other street plans, which I was not asking for, on Vallco Parkway. So I think the city was directed, someone directed this individual to play games. And I find that extremely offensive, and I have an idea who that was. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, if you could state your name as well. Thank you.
I don't believe I have to under the Brown Act.
Well, it's your prerogative. Thank you very much. The next speaker, with regard to the oral communications, and if you would please state your name. And
Lisa Warren.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to add that my concerns for the Stern Hotel, it is completely inappropriate for the space. I think San Jose knows that, but it's not of their aren't concerned by it. I know that when Savita was mayor, there was a letter written by the staff and signed by her to send to the city, voicing that Cupertino does not support the way it is. I can't recite the letter, but I am asking that the city, someone in the city, please send another letter now if you haven't already and make that available to the public. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Any other speakers from the public on any items that are not on the agenda? All right, very well. We'll go on to our public hearings item, item number 2, and that's consideration of the Vallco specific area, special area specific plan environmental impact report pursuant to the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. And I believe that we have members of the consulting team as well as our planning and community development department here to provide us an introduction to this item. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor and Chair and Jeff Paulson. I'm just going to introduce our consultants here who are going to give you an overview of the environmental impact report that was prepared for the Vallco Special Area Specific Plan. We have Judy Shanley here from David J. Powers, and we also have Francisca Church here with Farron Pierce, who will go over the traffic impacts and the traffic impact analysis that was done for the environmental impact report. I will also let you know that there is a desk item, which is a supplemental text revisions memo that has been provided for some minor text revisions that are not material. And in addition, there is also another a letter that was sent to us by the City of Santa Clara that is on its way that will be presented to you as a desk item, and will give you an verbal update on responses to that. And with that, I will turn it over to Judy for her presentation.
Okay, good morning. My name is Judy Shanley, and I am the president and a principal project manager at David Powers and Associates. Sorry. Once again, my name is Judy Shanley. I'm a president and principal project manager at David Powers and Associates, and we were hired by the City of Cupertino to assist them in preparing the Environmental Impact Report, or EIR, for the Vallco Specific Plan project. Just sort of background information, Environmental Impact Report, or EIR, is the most complex and lengthy, both in terms of process and the type of document for CEQA. An EIR is an informational document, and it is intended to inform decision makers about project impacts. It provides an identification of mitigation measures to avoid and reduce impacts, and it also identifies alternatives to the proposed project to avoid and reduce impacts. And those alternatives are also supposed to meet the most basic of objectives of the original proposed project. So just as far as how we got to where we are now, we started the process in December of last year, and the draft EIR was completed in May of 2018. The draft EIR analyzed a range of alternatives, and I'll provide a slide with the actual numbers in just one second. But the original proposed project included the general plan allocation of residential uses on the Vallco site. Another alternative that was analyzed is the general plan build-out with maximum residential, and that did not limit the residential proposed in terms of the general plan's allocation. It was a maximum build-out. A retail and residential alternative that didn't include any office. And also, in response to some community interest, we analyzed an alternative that had Vallco being reoccupied and re-tenanted in its current state as a mall. After the draft EIR was circulated, and in response to some of the interest of both the council and the public that was elicited at study sessions, an alternative to the proposed project was identified that was called the housing-rich alternative. This included more housing units than the original proposed project, going long on housing to include an increased opportunity for housing affordability, and it also incorporated some additional community benefits, a city hall, performing arts center, and space for schools. So the revised EIR, which was published just this past week, includes a revised project, which is a refinement of the original proposed project. It includes responses to comments that were obtained or received by the city during the 45-day circulation period. So the original draft EIR was prepared. The housing-rich alternative was evaluated in an amendment to the original draft EIR, and that was also circulated for 45 days. And at the conclusion of that time period, the final EIR was prepared, providing responses to both the comments on the original draft EIR and the EIR amendment. And in addition to responses to comments, the final EIR includes text revisions to the draft and the EIR amendment that provide clarifications or were needed to in response to some of the questions that came up on the draft. Subsequent to preparation of the final EIR, Pew just mentioned the supplemental text revisions document, and that includes, it's basically an errata that refines some of the mitigation measures. It makes some corrections that provide clarifications and correct typographical errors. And the most important thing about the supplemental text revisions is they do not make any substantial changes to the original analysis that was provided in the EIR document. So this slide provides a sort of summary of all of the permutations that were evaluated in the EIR, including the original what's called the previous project, the revised project, which is the major focus of the final EIR and of our work right now. And then the draft EIR included also the different alternatives that I had mentioned previously. So the revised project, all of the alternatives include the same uses, the same types of uses. It's just different mixes of the different uses. So the revised project is comprised of 460,000 square feet of commercial, 1,750,000 square feet of office space, 339 hotel rooms, 2,923 residential units, 35,000 square feet of civic space, and a 30-acre green roof. And the revised project was intended to address the City Council's desire for additional housing in conjunction with the community benefits that were related to the Performing Arts Center, City Hall, and some transportation benefits. Okay, so just a note, the revised project is actually larger than what the specific plan ended up with. But the specific plan, it's closer to the Tier 2 build out of the specific plan that was made public last week. But it's the revised project certainly covers all of the maximum build out of both the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 of the specific plan. So the EIR addresses all of the environmental issues that are discussed in the CEQA guidelines checklist. And these are listed here, everything from aesthetics, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, biological resources, cultural, both archaeology and historic, energy use, hazardous materials, hydrology, land use, noise and vibration, population and housing, public services, recreation, transportation, and utilities and service systems. And I'm now going to turn it over to Francisca Church of Para and Peers to talk about the traffic.
Can you hear me? Okay. A little closer. Okay, there we go. My name is Francisca Church, and I'm a senior associate with Fair and Peers Transportation Consultants. I was the project manager for the transportation impact analysis that was ultimately incorporated into the environmental document. So I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the analysis itself, and then some of the conclusions from the transportation analysis as it relates to intersection and freeway impacts. Sorry, let me get that closer. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is really the different scenarios that we analyzed as part of the transportation impact analysis, or TIA as we call it for short. There are basically 6 scenarios that we evaluated, the first being existing conditions. So existing conditions really represent what's on the ground today. It's based on data that we collected in January of 2018 of this year, and so really provides the backdrop for the analysis itself. And then you have scenario 2, which ultimately takes existing conditions and then adds on the project on top of that to evaluate what the transportation system would operate, how the transportation system would operate with the proposed project in place. And then scenario 3 is background conditions, or background without project conditions. And that's where we really start looking at future conditions on the roadway as it relates to the baseline. And so background really includes all developments that have recently been approved within Cupertino, but also adjacent jurisdictions. So this would include full build out of the Apple campus or Apple Park, other developments within Cupertino, but even adjacent jurisdictions as well. So that provides a baseline to say what would happen if everything that's currently approved in the vicinity, how the street would operate. The transportation network would operate. And then in scenario 4, we again, similar to scenario 2, add on the project trips from the revised project description to evaluate the impacts related to background conditions. And cumulative is really much further out. It's looking at year 2040. So basically what it includes, similar to background, it adds on though any pending developments, so development projects that are not necessarily approved but are in the approval process or stages. So again, we go out and ask City of Cupertino, but also adjacent jurisdictions for their list of pending projects that we then add to incorporate into the baseline for cumulative. And then scenario 6, again, is cumulative with project. So again, we're adding on the project trips on top of the cumulative volumes. So basically with the analysis, we're able to look at different horizon years, what would happen basically if Vallco would open tomorrow, what it would look like if development would that's already been approved were occupied, and then Vallco would happen, but also a future scenario if all the pending theoretical developments would move forward, what would the traffic look like in the area. We analyzed, let me see, we analyzed, I believe, 67 intersections as part of the transportation impact analysis and over 30 freeway segments, or no, around over 30 freeway segments in total. But in terms of the impacts, so those that have significant and unavoidable impacts, so those that cannot be mitigated through mitigation measures, we identified 18 intersections that would have significant and unavoidable impacts. I should note that these include intersection impacts that would be mitigated with TIF projects. So the city has a transportation impact fee program, has identified improvements for these intersections that in theory would mitigate the impact. However, this is the way the TIF structure works in terms of the city needing to collect the funds and then build the actual improvements. We, to be conservative, identify these as significant and unavoidable. Then these also include intersection impacts that are not within the city of Cupertino, so the other adjacent jurisdictions would be responsible for their implementation. And so since the city can't ensure or just direct an adjacent city to implement an improvement, we also identify those as significant and unavoidable just to be conservative, though there are many times actual improvements identified for those. And then in terms of the freeway impacts, we have about 31 segments that have significant unavoidable impacts. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about the actual location and numbers in a second. So this is a map that shows the intersection analysis. So you can see on the map all the black dots represent the intersections that we analyzed as part of the transportation impact analysis, so all 67 intersections. And these are color-coded to help identify where we identified impacts. So purple intersections, with the purple circle, you see intersection number 11, so that's De Anza and Stevens Creek Boulevard, as well as Stevens Creek and Wolf. They have significant unavoidable impacts, and there's no feasible mitigation measure for those locations. There are several intersections, those noted in orange. Again, those are the transportation impact fee intersections. So the city has identified improvements for those locations and will be collecting fees, and ultimately at some point will be as they collect fees, we'll be able to mitigate those impacts. But again, just for to be conservative, these were identified as significant and unavoidable. And then we also have in teal showing intersection impacts in jurisdictions outside of the city of Cupertino. And so again, we have impacts or mitigation measures identified, but the city cannot guarantee the implementation of those improvements. And then we also have a location at Vallco Parkway and Wolf Road where we have an impact that can be mitigated to less than significant levels with the identified mitigation measure. In terms of freeways, I don't have a nice map for this here, but it just allows to summarize where the freeway impacts were identified on what freeways. So we evaluated several freeway segments along Highway 85, I-280, I-880, Route 17. I believe there is one more freeway. I can't remember, there was another freeway segment we also analyzed, but we did not have any impacts. No, that's actually it, so strike that. So we have evaluated these 4 freeways. And so most of the impacts, as you can see, are on 280, which is not surprising given that most of the access is right there at Wolf and 280. And so there are 20 segments that were identified with impacts, followed by 85 with 6 impacted intersection segments, and then 880 with 5 segments that were identified. As part of this analysis, we also included a VMT analysis, vehicle miles travel analysis. Many of you have heard the state is moving away, at least for CEQA purposes, from level of service analysis to VMT analysis. It's known as SB 3735. It's not state law as of yet, but there is direction that each agencies will need to implement this over the next year and a half. And so just to start that process and get the decision makers and the public familiar with VMT analysis, we included that for information purposes. And this slide here summarizes the VMT, so total VMT, the average trip lengths, and the VMT per service population. So VMT is vehicle miles traveled. So basically it says of all the trips, different trip types have different trip lengths. So if you imagine if it's a retail trip, you're most likely the trip lengths are a little bit shorter because you're coming from Cupertino to Vallco Mall, versus office trips can be a little bit longer because you draw tracked trips from surrounding jurisdictions. And so that's ultimately what that looks at from a VMT analysis standpoint. And so you can see here the total VMT for the revised project, the previous project, which is a general plan build out with residential allocation, but also the housing rich alternative, and see how that varies. But what's more important than actual total VMT ultimately is the VMT per service population, because that helps normalizes the data. And so you can see here that this per service population, the revised project has a VMT about 29.7, the general plan build out around 30 miles, and then the housing rich around 28.5. So they're all relatively similar, but you can still see some nuance and variation there between the different land use alternatives. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Judy to talk about air quality. Thank you.
So other than, other than the traffic impacts, the environmental impact report found that the build out of the project would have a couple other significant unavoidable impacts, and those were related to construction air quality impacts due to the large size of the project, and particularly the large excavation that was proposed for the below grade parking, and also the construction equipment. There was a significant unavoidable air quality impact, temporary air quality impact during the construction period, even with all feasible mitigation measures included. There was also a significant unavoidable operational air quality impact, and this is primarily due to the volume of traffic trips that are generated by the project, and also due to some architectural coatings, but the project did include mitigation for that. But even with the mitigation, this was still significant and unavoidable over the thresholds of significance. It should be noted that both the previous project and all of the development alternatives that were analyzed had similar significant unavoidable impacts to the revised project. The other significant unavoidable impacts were related to noise, construction and operational noise impacts, and this was primarily due to the lengthy 10-year duration of construction for the build out of the project and construction impacts. They're both there's several different thresholds that are described in the CEQA checklist. One is whether or not there is a substantial increase over existing noise levels, and that increase is considered 3 decibels. And during the construction period, there would be an extended time period where noise would be elevated. And also whether the another threshold is if the noise levels are over what is stated as compatible for the land use, and that also during the construction period there would be times of construction activity that would cause excessive noise levels for the immediate area. For long-term noise level increases, that was another impact, and again, this includes all of the feasible and normal construction mitigation measures to reduce noise. For the long-term noise level increases, that is related to the increase in volume of traffic trips on the roads closest to Vallco. So due to the increases in traffic, that would cause a proportionate or also a noise level increase. There were the mitigation measures that were included in the project did reduce many of the impacts to a less than significant level. This includes construction air quality impacts, the diesel particulates and toxic air contaminants that can be part of construction exhaust. Those were all reduced to less than significant with mitigation measures. The cultural resources, there were, with the mitigation measures included in the project, there is no cultural resources impact. The GHG emissions, the revised project was found to have less than significant GHG emissions per service population with the inclusion of mitigation measures. Other mitigated impacts include hazardous materials. There are some sources of contamination, soil and groundwater contamination on the site due to the previous auto-related uses at Sears and JCPenney. Those would be mitigated to a less than significant level by common and standard mitigation measures, including the implementation of a site management plan and health and safety plan. And all of those are overseen by the Santa Clara County Department of Environmental Health and the Santa Clara County Fire Department. Construction vibration with mitigation was found to be less than significant, and the utilities were found to be less than significant. And with that, concludes our presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions from the committee? Oh,
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to conclude the presentation by just doing a very small comparison between what's existing out there and how that impact compares to the revised project.
Okay, sure, absolutely. Please.
There have been questions about how, if the mall was just re-tenanted, those impacts would compare to if there was new development there, and I just wanted to add a little bit about that. When you do compare in 3 areas of review, particularly noise, transportation, and greenhouse gas emissions, the impacts would be higher if the mall were just to be re-tenanted and fully occupied, particularly because there are no mitigation measures that we could implement or we could require to be implemented for the re-tenanting of the mall. And there are fewer impacts in some of the other areas because there wouldn't be all the construction impacts that are otherwise going to be impacting because of the excavation and other construction that's going to go on, which a re-tenanting of the mall would not involve. And with that, I also wanted to hand out this letter that we received just last evening, and we'll have a verbal update on this.
Okay, excellent. That's the letter from the city of Santa Clara?
That's correct.
That's right, okay, great. So, is that the end of your remarks, Pew, or did you have more remarks after this?
No.
No? Okay. Okay, great. So, we'll, yeah, sure. We'll wait till these are distributed in Pew's back before opening this up to questions for Judy, Francisca, as well as Pew. Are there any questions on the committee's part with regard to the presentation or what could be provided with regard to the final environmental impact report at this point? Let's see, Chair Paulson of Planning.
Okay, I have a few traffic questions. Francesca, if you don't mind, I speak partly as a former member of the Bicycle Pedestrian Commission, and one of my favorite quotes is where a person said, "Building more traffic lanes to solve traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to solve obesity." So I notice in the report that there are a number of so-called traffic improvements by adding new lanes. And I understand that's necessary if you're just looking at automobile traffic. But my concern is twofold. One, that only eventually encourages more automotive transportation. And second, that it doesn't account for future trends in transportation, such as electric skateboards, scooters, bicycles, that kind of thing. I understand. I've been here for 32 years, and I have not seen a whole lot of public transit improvements. And that is a very slow process. We think Vallco is a slow process. Look at VTA. But nonetheless, I wonder if we could reduce some of the additional traffic lane construction by promoting more alternate means of transportation and perhaps participating with VTA in some more frequent rapid bus service, et cetera. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I'm happy to answer that. To your saying, yes, you will build it and they will come. So, but we definitely took with the city's general plan really focuses on multimodal and a balanced transportation network, and so not necessarily focused just on vehicle travel. And so, yes, my presentation just right now really focused more on the intersection and freeway impacts. So we really took a holistic look at at evaluating how the transportation network within Cupertino would be affected by Vallco. And so when you actually look at many of the mitigation measures, the impacted locations, we many times did cite the city's general plan policies related to multimodal access and did not recommend widening of streets. So there's, for example, the significant impact at De Anza and Stevens Creek Boulevard. Yes, you can widen it to mitigate the freeway, the intersection impact for vehicles, but it does have secondary effects to pedestrian travel and bicycle travel. And so there was not a recommendation made to actually widen it, so just to keep it as significant and unavoidable. There are also several other locations where widening of the roadway would have mitigated it, but we decided that more technology-based improvements to signal operations were the more appropriate way to go, just to help the flow of traffic versus just building more capacity. So we did overall try to take a really balanced approach to this. Generally, where we have proposed widening of roadways, it's really related to already planned facilities or planned improvements, and so since they're already in the works, so to speak, or planned, so then we apply those as a mitigation measure. But we really did try to look at it holistically and not always just recommend widening the roadway system.
I thought so. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
One other question about noise. I've noticed that cars are becoming quieter, and I think they're going to be more and more quiet in the future as you see more electric vehicles. Did you account for that in terms of your noise, or is the noise mainly from tire and air noise?
The noise analysis, I do not believe incorporates the quieter electric vehicle. It provides a standard noise from tire wear and normal engine use, and there is a traditional thought that a doubling of traffic volume roughly generates a 3 decibel or a perceptible noise level increase. And so the calculation of what the additional noise would be from traffic is based purely on the volume of additional traffic trips. So it has not yet incorporated any reductions based upon quieter vehicles.
Okay, well, we'll probably look for adjustments to those standards as more data become available in the future. I also just want to thank you for condensing a ponderous document into just a few minutes of presentation, so thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Is there anyone else who would like to ask some questions of our presenters here? All right, I have a few. So I noticed that in the commercial envelope, we're at 400, and I apologize for not being able to read my own notes. I think it's 460,000 square feet is what you presented. In the less intense plan, I guess Plan 1, there is 600,000 square feet of retail proposed. So how are we going to reconcile that with the 460,000 square feet studied in the EIR? Because it seems just to add a little bit of from my own perspective as to how this envelope got studied, I think you're probably starting with an envelope defined by what was in the prior proposal, right? And with regard to the current specific plan process, I guess through interactive, discussions between our staff and the property owner / prospective applicant, there was probably an increase of some of the willingness to add commercial. So if we do have a potential essentially zoning proposal, right, with a specific plan on for consideration that has 600,000 square feet, how do we get to? Oh, so the prior project has 600,000. Okay, so the slide where you indicated what was being studied, it indicated that the envelope of commercial was 460,000 square feet. I guess the threshold question is that accurate, or was I perhaps misinterpreting what was being conveyed?
Well, for each of the alternatives, the trip generation was calculated as a whole. So when the original previous project had a higher number of commercial and a higher number of office, the revised project is smaller and is included within the envelope of impacts that was evaluated in the original. It has a higher number of residential units, which caused a greater number of residential related traffic trips. And then with that traffic data, that was then also converted into air quality impacts and noise impacts and that sort of thing. Right. So the original draft EIR, the EIR amendment, and then the final did the calculations again to ensure that the revised project was within the limits of the overall envelope of impacts that was originally evaluated. And for the most part, the housing-rich alternative had the highest level of impacts, and the revised project, even though it has a little bit more office, it is has fewer overall traffic trips and impacts.
Okay, thank you. And Pew, you stated that you wanted to...
Yes, maybe I'm understanding your question a little differently from the way Judy is. The way that I think you're asking what in Tier 1, because there is 600,000 square feet in the specific plan, and
yes.
Tier 2 has 460 or 485. How does that compare? In Tier 1, the amount of office square footage is much lower than in Tier 2. And so when for purposes of the EIR, because we've studied the maximum envelope in terms of Tier 2, we're fine with having the amount of development that is being proposed in Tier 1.
Okay. So let's take a step back here, and I appreciate your answers. I appreciate your positioning, but I just want to try to make sure that we're studying something that has a sufficient envelope for us to proceed under our specific plan plans at this point. And so I'm reminded of a question from the public, which is actually a very good one, during our prior process regarding, well, do we have an environmental impact report that covers the amount of housing that we're talking about? And I think that was the genesis for some of the amendments that we were creating. So I don't want to create an additional need for an amendment, but in your assessment, if we're not actually taking a project that has this amount of housing, this amount of commercial, and this amount of office, and putting it within one envelope for a study, are we compromising potentially our ability to go forward and say, look, there isn't something that captures this entire envelope? I mean, to me, it seems like we should have added another 140,000 square feet of commercial to this overall study if we're going to be studying maximum envelopes for the sake of saying that as long as it stays within this, our analyses are legitimate. So tell me why that impression is incorrect. In as straightforward a manner as you can. Yes.
So the impacts are highest for the housing-rich alternative, which is the 600,000 with the 1.5 million square feet of office, and the 3,250 housing units, which is the largest program that
Sure.
we've studied.
Okay.
And so with the proposed specific plan, and within the what is proposed in the specific plan, we're covered with this EIR for those impacts. In terms of if the council wants to see some changes made to the program, we would have to review, do a quick analysis in terms of what the EIR is covered in order to see whether whatever program the council wishes to adopt with the specific plan, whether that's covered under the EIR or not.
Okay, that's a fair enough answer. And so what I'm hearing is that we probably do need to, take a look at the commercial, because you are indicating the residential as well as the office, and then following it up with, well, if the council does decide to have a particular choice, and in this case, you do have the first choice that does have that 600,000 square feet of commercial, correct? And it's not a de minimis amount of residential. It is, I believe, 1,700 prior to the density bonus potentially being applied, as well as 750,000 square feet of office. So that's just, I guess, a question, and I think it's essentially been answered. So I'll go on to my next question. With regard to the noise levels, I appreciated some of the description with regard to air quality and intersections. So if a noise level is significant and unavoidable, what does that mean with regard to some quantifiable metrics? I mean, is there a decibel threshold that we can define and say it's going to be this loud? I was noticing long-term there are some noise levels that, correct me if I'm wrong, that were also under the SU category.
So I assume you're concerned both with construction noise and the long-term operational noise effects?
I'm concerned with any of them that have, well, I guess I should say I'm more concerned with the long term, right?
Okay.
Because the construction noise is something that you can see a sun setting, but of course it's also something that's very important to try to mitigate if we can. But in terms of that noise level, is there a quantifiable metric for defining what that is?
So the EIR analysis started with an evaluation of the existing noise levels, and the site is adjacent to 280 and Stevens Creek and Wolf. So all of those roads have a lot of vehicular traffic and are fairly noisy. And given that the specific plan did not yet, has not yet been refined enough with detailed projects to know where residential is going to be versus office, the noise analysis has contour lines of what the noise levels are at different locations within the site. And based on that, it had recommendations of where, minimum setbacks from 280 and from Stevens Creek and Wolf in order to meet, for example, for commercial land use, the maximum acceptable noise level outdoors is 70 decibels. And so it had thresholds, a contour line showing where the 70. And it had also setback distances in order to meet the city's residential noise standards, which would be a 65 exterior noise standard. And with that, it also includes, as a part of the state building code, there are requirements for detailed project-specific noise analyses to be done at the time building plans are actually prepared to ensure that interior noise levels are maintained at 45 decibels or lower, which is what the building code and state requires. The city desire is to have 65 decibels as the residential exterior noise level. And so there are standard permit conditions included in the project to design the future buildings such that the non-residential uses are buffering the residential uses from noise and that sort of thing.
I see. Okay, great. And with regard to the mitigations that are not possible where you have that SU category, does that mean basically from the perspective of any given resident nearby, we're going to be unavoidably exceeding that 65 decibels? Or are there any situations, are there any situations residentially where we essentially can't be in compliance with our city requirements insofar as noise is concerned?
The primary, the long-term operational noise impact resulting from vehicular traffic is not an impact saying that noise levels are in excess of a certain threshold, a 65. It's more that there is an increase, a perceptible noise level increase, and that is the threshold of what the significance is. It should be noted that with all of the alternatives, including the occupied mall, there would be an increase in traffic and
Sure.
associated noise level increases.
Sure. And then let's move back from long-term into the construction phases. Are you recommending any particular things that could be done with regard to times of day in order to alleviate some of these noise impacts on our adjacent neighborhoods potentially?
Well, as a part of both mitigation and as a condition of approval, the project would be required to meet the city's municipal code related to construction hours, which I believe allow for construction 7 to 8 p.m., 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on weekdays. And then only there are certain types of construction allowed on weekends, but those would be subject to approval by the city community development staff.
Okay, great, thank you. You had a slide that was also in the same topic of significant and unavoidable resources impacts, and it was in the context of cultural resources. Could you perhaps elaborate on what that is particularly?
Oh, sure. There really are no identified or recorded archaeological resources on the site,
Okay.
but nonetheless, the project included an evaluation of the subject and includes mitigation measures that in the during construction and earth-moving activities, if anything were found, that all construction would stop, and depending upon what the resource was, and qualified archaeologists would be called into the city to assist in providing a mitigation plan. And then there are also additional requirements in the event Native Americans burials are found. I'm not aware of those having been anywhere in the area, so it's unlikely, but it's included anyway. The Vallco sign along 280 is identified in the general plan as a special resource, and so as a part of the mitigation for that, there was, I believe, documentation of the history of the mall, and also having some sort of informative kiosk or something like that as mitigation, and that was for the historic aspect.
I see. Okay, and then my final question for the time being has to do with Pugh's comment regarding impacts from a re-tenanted mall. Is there a section within the EIR that reflects the assertions that you're making with regard to what happens if there's a re-tenanted mall and us not having certain ability to impose mitigations? And what section of the EIR would that refer to?
So in the draft EIR, in every section, every impact analysis section, there is a description of the impacts from a re-tenanted mall.
Okay.
So it's been identified throughout the document.
Okay, and insofar as the basic assertion that we would have fewer ability to require mitigations, or less ability, I should say, is there any particular part of the EIR that someone reading it could refer to get a sense of what our limitations or relative limitations to
So in every
you know, regulate
section,
would be.
in every section we talk about it. Essentially, the mall is a permitted land use. There are no discretionary actions required in order to re-tenant the mall, and it's exempt from CEQA. So we could not impose the mitigation measures that we can on newer projects with the re-tenanting of the mall. And we do have, I did want to point out, we do have a table that identifies the, we just lost the table. It essentially, and if we can get that table back, we can show you. It's also in the final EIR. This table is in the final EIR, and it talks about the, it basically compares the different impacts from each of the, for each of the alternatives with each other. It essentially compares them. And we have that back now. So that table is in the final EIR. If you are interested, I think it's called the summary of impacts, or summary of project and project alternative impacts.
Okay.
And that table is in the final EIR so that you can compare the impacts between each of the alternatives.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that if there was some re-tenanting and some substantial remodeling done, there could be some opportunities for the city to go ahead and impose some requirements that would tend to mitigate impacts?
There are standard permit conditions that we do impose with regard to construction, but we would not be able to impose any mitigation measures related to transportation impacts, or there would be some noise, you know, standard, you know, like the construction hours and things like that. But in terms of, you know, repaving the streets with rubberized asphalt or things like that, that would possibly go above and beyond what we could require, which are incorporated as mitigation measures in the event of new development.
Right, and we wouldn't be able to impose any kind of transportation impact fee if we were to enact one, correct?
Absolutely not.
On top of the 1.2 million squares that exist there right now, unless they were to go in excess of that number, correct?
Unless there was new development, and it would only be for the net new development.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much.
welcome.
Were there any other questions, Chair Paulson?
This is one sort of tangential comment about noise. 280 is at the end of my block, and I've noticed that it's quietest during maximum rush hour because traffic is almost at a stop. So I don't know if that's incorporated in various calculations, but actually, if we wanted to make things quieter, we put more cars out there, especially electric ones that make no noise when they start up in intersections. That's just a thought. But I have a couple of tree questions. As my colleagues know, perhaps ad nauseum, that I'm a big tree fan. But with regard to the impact of trees on the greenhouse gas emissions, and various other things like heat island effect, is that incorporated into the EIR, especially as the trees grow and increase their benefit over the years?
The analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions is primarily, or it's basically due to all the elements of the project. So it's the vehicle trips, the air quality, or excuse me, HVAC, electricity, natural gas, architectural coatings, all those things. It does not offset any of that due to any benefit provided by the trees.
Okay,
So
there are some data available. And I'm not asking you to revise this or come out with another edition, but there are data about that. Second question about trees is, I notice in one of the EIRs there were some species identified that would help capture the soot and the dust from the freeway. I live downwind from 280. We get a lot of soot. But I'm also on the board of a tree planting group where the person who's doing the trees for Apple planted a certain species of oak with hairy leaves that is designed to capture the soot. So I would encourage the project as it moves forward to consider the maximum soot catching capacity of trees planted along, especially 280, because the wind blows down toward the project most of the time.
Okay, good idea.
Thanks very much. We'll open it up for, Interim City Manager Chan, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple questions of clarifications. Can you go over one more time in this report, the maximum program that we study, for example, how many housing units, how many office, how many retail. I know the report contains different alternatives and you comments on those alternatives, but the report studied the maximum number, and what would those be?
Right. The report addressed all of the impacts of all the different permutations, and it focused on the alternative that ended up with the highest impact was the housing-rich alternative.
So, for example, on the housing, you would have studied the 3250 or 2923.
But it's basically for each of the different alternatives, the impact is looked at as a whole of the development. So the different land uses can be mixed and matched as long as the overall envelope of impact is within that envelope.
Yeah. So I'm just going to give some example. On the housing-rich alternative, it appears that it has the highest number of all the numbers that you shown there. So 3250 is the number that's studied. If council decided to move to 3,500, I'm just making it up for clarification purposes. Under the environmental report, that all the alternatives that you study, the council would not be able to move to add or increase to 3,500 without another study.
There would have to be some offsetting reduction in square footage of something else, whether it was office or commercial, in order to offset that, and that would have to be looked at.
Okay, so on the commercial, the number study is 600,000.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
Sorry, I was looking at the chart without looking at your nodding. Sorry.
For the commercial, yes, we have studied 600,000 square feet as the maximum. For the office, the maximum that has been studied is 1.75, but that's with an offsetting reduction in the commercial and in the residential.
So on tier one, that on the specific plan, we have 750 retails.
It's
and
actually
how's that?
600,000 retail, 750,000 office.
Oh, seven. That's
Yes,
so
339
sorry.
hotels.
All these numbers got mixed up.
Right.
Yes,
and
thank
I
you.
apologize. We should have had the 2 tiers for the specific plan on this
but I just want to make sure that I understand what is the maximum number versus retail or office that is studying here, so that if council or direction or planning commission recommendation exceed what we study, then we have to do another additional analysis, assuming the number, even if you move the number, it still won't fit. Is that correct?
You can't, an alternative couldn't be selected without additional review that picked the highest number for each category. There has to be some offsetting reductions if you want more residential, for example.
Okay, thank you. I only have one more question. Had to do with transportation. If I understood you earlier in your analysis, you're trying to take the more balanced approach, and you look at all of the current planned transportation alternatives and incorporate those mitigation impact in this study. So is it fair to assume that there may be some innovative transportation technology that people are talking about now but have not incorporated in any plan? Is it fair to say that whatever impact those might be have not yet reflected in this document in front of us?
If I understand your question correctly, there is, in terms of mitigation measures, there are different technologies that look more at improving the operation, so the flow of an intersection, for example, versus just adding capacity. So we call that ITS, Information Technology System. So we have included ITS improvements within the mitigation measures. They haven't been identified for that reason because ITS changes really quickly. And so we just identified ITS improvements that would help mitigate the identified impact. And so what that might be 5 years from now, to your point, yes, technology is changing very rapidly in that regard.
Right. Can you give us some example of those ITS that you might have considered here?
So for example, along Stevens Creek Boulevard, you have several pretty large intersections that are relatively closely spaced together, between Lawrence Expressway and Wolf Road. And so you can look at signal optimizations. There's different technologies there that can help a lot of times signals with the way they operate, but there's technology that can help read the vehicle volume flows and direct it better, more automated, so to speak. There's also different technology for pedestrian crossings. Right now, usually the pedestrian crossing time is timed, so it says, okay, it's going to take a pedestrian 30 seconds to get across the intersection. That means cars have to wait for 30 seconds. But there's technology being developed that's going to be more reliable, that's able to detect the pedestrians in the crosswalk and be able to adjust the timing that way. So those are some other operational things that are kind of coming out right now that would help with the overall flow along the corridor. Just some examples.
What about some roadway improvements, above ground, underground, bullet train?
Bullet train.
I'm just making these things up.
We didn't necessarily focus on major infrastructure improvements. So anything that goes above ground or below ground, double-decking freeways has been mentioned before. I mean, the Caltrans is just not going to be doing that. So it's just not something that we looked at. So we focused more on the actual technology application within the right-of-way that we have today.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Any more questions from the committee? All right, we'll go ahead and open this up to public comment. Please feel free to form a line behind the microphone there, and we'll provide 3 minutes. Please state your name if you wish, and I will give you an indication of 1 minute remaining as well as 15 seconds remaining. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Liang Chao. Could you please put up the slide with the alternatives? So the notice of preparation sent out did not give any indication that the City Council is considering a general plan amendment. The notice of preparation for the EIR only specified the existing general plan, which actually include 1.2 million square feet of retail space. That's a max. And then I already commented to the staff multiple times, all the other numbers for office, housing units, they are all maximum allocation. Why do we only list the minimum allocation for retail space? That's inconsistent. We should not give the public the impression that somehow the City Council reduced the maximum for retail space along the way. I hope we didn't. If we didn't, the chart should reflect exactly what's in the general plan as the previous project. The maximum for the retail right now is 1.2 million square feet. Minimum is 600,000. Okay. And another thing is, I wonder, when did the City Council reach an agreement, consensus, or gave any instruction that we want to evaluate this revised project with 460,000. When did the City Council give the staff instruction to reduce the retail space? Was that ever put on any City Council agenda for discussion? I don't think so. And when did we ever give the staff the direction to consider housing units that's up to 2,900 units? If we are doing any EIR, the instruction should come from the City Council. But then all I know from the City Council direction is to do the EIR based on the existing general plan. So I wonder the legality of this EIR. There has been no City Council direction to consider any alternative or even general plan amendment on the Vallco site. If I miss any City Council meeting, let me know. I hereby make a public records request for any document which led to the revised project or any of the parameters provided here. And I would like to know how those numbers came about. And also, how about the noise level for existing residents? How come we are only talking about noise level for the future residents who are going to choose to live on this site? And then I wonder, what's the percentage of traffic that you consider in your analysis that's commute traffic? I read a report that their commute traffic only contribute to about 20% of the traffic, but retail space in Cupertino would reduce the total amount of retail shopping. Thank you.
All right. Next speaker. Welcome.
Hello, City Council. Oh, boy. Okay. Hello, panel, ERC.
Committee, yes.
I'm Jennifer Griffin. Oh, we said too many meetings. Anyway, first of all, let me extend my sympathies, congratulations, whatever, to our city staff, our illustrious panel over here, the public. We all learn more when Vallco goes through iterations, and I'm sorry if I sound cross, but this has been going on since 2007, maybe 2005, and we had why do I know about redevelopment agencies? Vallco, yay, okay. So I'm gonna say right now, my first plan in this is, I think the easiest thing to do would be to just re-tenant them all. We just had Orchard Supply closed in one day, and the next day they hit the Sears at Capitola Mall has gotten canned, and it was both corporate decisions, Lowe's and Sears Holding. And they were, so those two places can go to Vallco. We shop there. I know those places are loaded. Orchard is loaded. Put it back at Vallco. I'd go there now. The other thing is, maybe they can just sell it to Amazon as a distribution hub. I mean, Amazon's buying everything. I think that's where the orchards are going to be. They're going to be distribution hubs. Anyway, first of all, we want to make sure that we maintain the existing trees. The street trees are blessed ashes that are on the frontages of Wolf and Stevens Creek Boulevard. We need to keep the heart of the city full 35-foot setback public right-of-way with the existing trees that are there now. Those things, I don't care what Vallco's doing, but those trees are public resources. They are city street trees. Please don't let them being taken down. And if we widen the streets, we wind up taking down street trees, as was evidenced by Apple on Tantau, but the city put the trees back. We don't want that happening. I'm not sure how much more time I have. 1 minute. Okay, I'll talk fast. Okay, the other thing is, okay, we need to slow this whole thing down. If we're going to build a quality product at Vallco, we need to slow it down and study it more. This has not been studied adequately. I mean, we're talking about a major potentially destination area for the whole area. How can we study it? I mean, you guys have tried really hard, but this warrants another 5 to 10 years. Also, what about all the traffic? Eastern Cupertino's just getting hosed big time. We've got the entire Stevens Creek Boulevard Urban Village rollout of 20 stories. Nobody's thrown that in the equation. San Jose is not helping with that stupid hotel. The other thing is, we've got all these children, 3,000 children. They're going to be going to Cupertino High School. Are they going to be walking across Stevens Creek Boulevard?
Thank you very much.
Good Lord. Okay, thank you.
Next speaker. Welcome.
Hi, thanks. Lisa Warren. So, Mayor Paul asked some questions that I had about the re-tenanting option. Are you ready? Can I don't...
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Are you ready? Okay, so he asked some questions about the re-tenanting option that I was going to ask, and about requirements. And I mean, even a residential single home, the minute you go beyond a certain amount of remodeling, you kick in all these requirements. I know that firsthand. So there has to be, as was indicated, but I'm not sure there was a level of indication of how many things we can control with tenant improvements and any remodeling and additions. To me, I believe there's probably more possibilities for mitigations than are being expressed. So that's just one point. And when in studying the air quality, you talk later about interior and exterior noise and air. Everything that I heard was talking about moving traffic or non-moving traffic, but street traffic was the big push on air quality. There's obviously other things. I don't know, there's no mention really of mechanical units, mechanical needs, what those do. And without knowing what the exact project is, how can you even study that if you don't know what units they're using, how many, yada, yada, yada. And then the internal, we've got underground parking in mass with gases trapped, and then we have a green to pay trapping it all in the project. So I find it hard to believe that there's no mention of what happens on the 51 acres to the air quality, let alone outside for the rest of us. So I hope there's something in there, and I wish it had been discussed, if there is.
1 minute.
Okay, and then when we talk about offsetting of square footage and the ability to mix and match uses, I cannot conceive how that's possible when things aren't even defined apples to apples. You have commercial, office, civic space, and green, well, we won't count the roof, in square feet. You have hotel rooms, less significant obviously, and residential in dwelling units. How can you mix and match? How can you even know how many square feet those units will take? I bring this up all the time because for some reason the description of housing is limited to units and not square footage, which is ridiculous.
15 seconds.
And speaking of soot catching trees, I'd like to know what these trees actually do with the soot they catch. And there has to be some saturation point where they can't take any more soot. So then what happens? And does it create a groundwater problem when the rain comes down and the soot's washed off?
Next speaker, welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is David Fung. I'm a planning commissioner, but speaking as a resident. I just had two quick comments. One of them was that I hope that the presentation materials might be posted as a supplemental material in the, for this record of this meeting. I suspect you probably could find them all amid the EIR documents, but it can be a tough search. In particular, I think that the traffic mitigation map was actually a really useful map. And then the other item I would just say, I think there was a pretty quick question from Mayor Paul about understanding the mix of what was studied and how the envelope should be done. This was also recapped by our city manager. I think that having a really clear answer on that is probably important. So that may be something that, as you go into deliberation, you might probe that a little bit more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Next speaker. Any other speakers? Welcome.
I have a question about the underground storage tank that was found in the Phase 1 environmental site assessment. It is next to the storm drain on the west side of Sears, and I'm wondering why they didn't lift the lid of the storage tank, and I don't see any indication that the environmental engineers filed a complaint when they found what they believed was a waste oil tank there. And then I noticed in the final EIR documents, you have a report about some mitigation that was done in the 90s, and it has some errors in it, and the environmental engineers would have noticed those errors as well. So I'm wondering why a Phase 2 environmental site assessment hasn't been done, especially considering it was an orchard. going back at least till the 30s. And, you know, as I had said at the previous open session to talk about the EIR, they used to use lead arsenate, which is a mixture of lead and arsenic, and then they moved on to DDT. And you're looking at 50 acres of soil, which would be disturbed, and that was not mentioned in your reports because you didn't do a study on it. You didn't test the soil to see what was there. So that's another issue. You're looking at doing a cap on Wolf and I-280. And you have a picture of that for future plans. And then you're also talking about putting a 30-acre green roof covering 30 out of 50 acres
1 minute.
in impermeable surface. So you're going to have a cap next to 30 acres covered, next to 200,000 vehicles per day on the freeway, and then your Wolf and Stevens Creek traffic. And there is no study about what the environmental conditions are going to be like for the people living there, and I think that that's very irresponsible. And we're looking at 149 tons of air pollutants, 31 tons non-mobile, and 118 tons mobile. And that's pretty appalling. So I really don't understand
15
why
seconds.
you chose to do such large projects, and now you're even larger than the SB 35 plan. So none of this makes any sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any further speakers from the public on this matter? Okay, we'll bring it back to the committee for any further comments and potentially a motion following our discussion. Would anyone like to kick us off with regard to deliberation and comments? Chair Paulson.
I would just like to commend the staff and the consultants for doing a fantastic job. I wrote a 430-page government document once. It took me over a year, and you folks have done a wonderful job in what has ended up being a compressed time frame. So I really commend your work and the quality of the products you produce. So thank you.
Any other comments? Discussion points? Okay, well, let me follow up on a couple of items here. One of the speaker commented that it would be good to have the presentation materials as part of the public record, and so I would like to request that those be made available, readily available, and so if we can put those online. There was a question regarding a storage tank. Would anyone like to address that question? Because frankly, I'm not really that clear on what the official status and what the accurate background is on that. So did you encounter that issue in your study?
Sure. So we have in the EIR a subconsultant, Cornerstone Earth Group, who is a well-renowned both geologist and hazardous material consulting firm. They their work on the EIR was to review the several Phase 1 environmental assessments that had already been done, and I think there had been a couple of Phase 2 where they actually do soil testing, and then also to do a new Phase 1 analysis, which includes looking at all of the regulatory agency records and fire department records. And from that, they came up with some identified issues of concern. One of the questions that was brought up in the final is why certain pieces of information were not included in the document as part of the appendices, and while they were reviewed and included in the assessment, they were not physically attached, and that is normal. You don't include, the fire department records include huge volumes of material that aren't all end up in the Phase 1 typically as part of an appendix. Due to the fact that the site is currently developed and was being used recently for the school district, they found that there was nothing that, none of the impacts that they felt, in their professional opinion, warranted soil or groundwater evaluation at this time, and thought that rather than doing it in advance, they could prepare a soil management plan and a health and safety plan that would be implemented then at the time that the project went forward. And as a part of that, it includes measures to account for all the different parts of the Sears and JCPenney garage that still exist, any underground storage tanks that still exist. They'd also be testing for agricultural chemicals from the prior use of the site as orchards. And with that, they have a plan in place to both prevent impacts to any workers on site, construction workers, as well as ensure that neighbors and future residents are not subject to any hazardous material impacts.
Yeah. And with regard to not being able to put all the information and materials in the appendix, that's perfectly understandable. You wouldn't want to, create volumes and volumes of material. Of course, with the electronic age, I guess it's a little bit easier to reference things and include them, in soft copy. But with respect to where people could find these materials, are they referenced within the report itself or in some of those appendices?
I believe they are referenced, and they're also they would be at the places, the repositories, the fire department records, and they're referenced that way as well.
Okay. And then with regard to the envelope of the study, perhaps this is an artifact of EIRs that I just don't fully appreciate and understand well enough. My understanding now is that you actually studied multiple envelopes, right? And then there was one envelope called a revised project. Is that accurate? So did you actually study the housing heavy with, or did you study the, I forget what you call it. Can you bring up the, oh, great. So you have the revised project up there. And then under project alternatives, there's general plan build out with maximum residential alternative, and then 3 more underneath that. Were all 5 of those envelopes studied within this EIR?
Yes. Over the course of the preparation of the EIR, the draft EIR original focused on the original proposed project, and then as well at an equal level of detail, it had a full analysis of the general plan build out with maximum residential alternative, retail and residential alternative, occupied and retenanted mall, and then the EIR amendment that came out later had a full analysis of the housing rich alternative.
Great.
And then the final EIR includes a full analysis of the revised project. But all of those were fully vetted and evaluated for all the subject areas.
Right. Okay, great. Well, maybe this is more of an artifact of this presentation and the table, because we do have one that's bolded and on the very top line that states revised project. Is that a function of EIRs that you have to identify a particular project and label it the revised project? Because if we're going through a process that's basically determining what potentially that project might be, it would seem to be optically a little bit perhaps ill-advised, to identify one particular one and say that this is the revised project. Or is that just a function of how EIRs operate? It's good to identify one particular thing.
In CEQA, you need to have a preferred or proposed project, and so originally that was the what's called in the table the previous project. As the specific plan process evolved, it was determined that there was a desire for more residential units, and so we wanted to make sure that if that was in fact the preferred project that was subject of the final specific plan, that it was fully vetted and has become what is the preferred project for the EIR.
Okay, so there's no CEQA requirement necessarily that you take all the maximum categories of each of the type of usages and study that, even though it might be well advised given. It may be well advised given the kind of natural vicissitudes of the discussion, I guess. But it's probably impractical, right, to say that, we're going to be looking at 2 million of office, 1.2 of retail, 4,000 units of housing. But there's no requirement that says that you have to study an envelope that has all of those things at the same time, correct?
No, there is no requirement. You're supposed to look at a proposed project or preferred project and then a range of reasonable alternatives.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, are there any further comments that we'd like to provide? Interim City Manager Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to follow up on the couple public comments and wanted you to let me know what you know. One of the comments is, I think Judy addressed, is that we have a geologist looked at the underground water condition or the soil condition. And the comment was that there may be some work done on phase 1, but may not be all of the phase work have been completed. Do you know anything about that?
Well, it is true that the actual soil and groundwater testing has not yet been done for the project, and so the EIR lays out a plan for that. And in addition, the EIR also evaluates the impacts from the excavation and removal of all of the soil for the underground parking garage.
So what is the requirement to get those things? Do we know if all phase 1s have been completed? And what is the requirement for phase 2? Do you know?
The phase 1 for hazardous materials has been completed for the project. And as the individual, I believe it would be as individual development sites are proposed, then additional testing of soil and groundwater contamination would be done to determine if there were any impacts, any levels of contaminants above the appropriate levels for the intended use of the project specific location, and then the mitigation would be done.
So if there's no project approved on this site, what are the chances of some work is being done on phase 2?
If the mall was to remain in its existing condition and be re-tenanted, there wouldn't be a need for any environmental review. Now, that said, if something was to reoccupy where the auto service uses was, there are laws related to removal of underground storage tanks and things like that. But there wouldn't be a comprehensive system of testing the soil and groundwater across the site. It would just stay in place.
Another comment had to do with the size of the project, and it appeared that the phase 2 project is larger than SB 35 project. Is that true?
I'm just trying to organize my thoughts here. So in terms of the office square footage, it is my understanding that no, the office square footage with this alternative is lower than the SB 35 project. In terms of the residential units, we looked at this is essentially the program for the entire Vallco special area, so it includes certain sites outside of what the SB 35 project covers. So in terms of the residential housing units, it is larger than what SB 35 covers, which covers a smaller area of the special area. And in terms of commercial square footage, this program is a little larger. Because it does include a community benefit in terms of what might be a performing arts center, as council had directed staff to look at ways of incorporating community benefits into the program. And so this program was tailored to address that desire from council from their June 4th study session. So it just covers those things.
Thanks.
Oh, sure. Director Shrivastava.
Pew, if you could just confirm that this not only includes units in Simeon and the KCR site, but it also includes an additional density bonus over state, so even on the Sandhill site.
Correct. And actually, if I may speak to that a little bit, this actually looks at, in terms of the general plan density of the site, the specific plan essentially keeps it at 35 dwelling units per acre, but the EIR looks at a higher number of units, which is considered a city density bonus program, a city community benefits density bonus program that allows for additional dwelling units in exchange for certain items, which include increased affordability above the city's 15% requirement, a potential performing arts center at the site, some space for the Fremont Union High School District, for a high school innovation center and an adult education center. And it also, in terms of the specific plan, limits any additional incentives and concessions that might be available to a developer under the state density bonus program, but would not be under the community benefits density bonus program. So it does limit heights to exactly what the specific plan identifies.
Any other further comments? Nope. Well, I would like to ask or make a comment regarding job creation before we entertain a motion. I have asked for, and I'll make a formal request, to get a sense of the number of jobs that would be associated with these various square footages of uses, including, but more particularly, especially the office square feet, be it 1 million square feet or 1.75 million. If it's in the ER, please do let us know what your reference would be there. That would be very useful information to have, and also the commercial side of it as well, because of course commercial space creates jobs too. But without any further commentary, I will be happy to entertain a motion with regard to this environmental impact report. Would anyone care to bring it? Chair Paulson?
I move that the Environmental Review Committee recommend that the City Council certify the Vallco specific plan EIR. Is that enough?
Is there a second to that motion?
I second.
Okay. Chair Paulson motions and Mr. Mosley seconds. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Our next item is old business. Is there anybody from the committee that would like to indicate old business or bring up an item of old business? Seeing shakes of the head. How about new business? That's the next item. Our next item is staff and committee reports. No desire to discuss staff or committee reports? Very well. Then that brings us to adjournment. Thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.